The rain fell in cascading sheets, drumming against the roof of my pickup like impatient fingers. I sat parked across from the Rosewood Hotel, my phone's blue glow illuminating the cab as I watched the pulsing dot on my screen. Margot's signal hadn't moved in 2 hours. Room 318 if the front desk clerk was to be believed. I hadn't planned on becoming the kind of man who tracks his wife's phone. But I hadn't planned on a lot of things. Just high school friends catching up, she'd said 3 nights ago, packing an overnight bag with careful precision. You'd be bored to tears, Eli. Her smile never quite reached her eyes as she kissed my cheek. Besides, it's your chance for a guy's weekend. Call Davis. I didn't call Davis. Instead, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and stared at the emptiness she left behind in our bedroom. 10 years of marriage, and suddenly I couldn't recognize her voice when she lied. The rain intensified as I stepped out of the truck, my collar turned up against the March chill. Portland in springtime, all mist and secrets. The hotel lobby gleamed with polished marble and soft lighting, making my damp jeans and weathered jacket feel like an intrusion. Checking in, sir? The desk clerk was young, with carefully styled hair and a name tag that read Cameron. No, I'm looking for someone. I slid my phone across the counter, showing Margot's latest profile picture. My wife. She's attending a reunion. Room 318. Something flickered across Cameron's face, recognition then discomfort. Mrs. Carver? She's a regular guest. He glanced around before lowering his voice. She's been coming here for years. The words hit like a physical blow. Years. Not days, not weeks. Years. There must be some mistake. My voice sounded hollow in my ears. We're not from Portland. We live in Seattle. Cameron's expression shifted to pity, which was somehow worse than the revelation itself. I've been working here 4 years, sir. She usually comes twice a month, always midweek. Always the same room. He hesitated. Always with the same gentleman. I felt my world tilt on its axis. Twice a month. 4 years. The business trips to Portland. The client meetings that ran late. The reunion that wasn't a reunion at all. This gentleman, I managed to ask, does he have a name? Cameron's eyes darted to a security camera in the corner. I can't say more, sir. Hotel policy. I've already said too much. I nodded, understanding his position even as rage began to simmer beneath my skin. Thank you for your honesty. I slid a 50 across the counter. I was never here. Outside, the rain had transformed into a gentle mist, clinging to my face like grief. I sat in my truck, staring up at the warm glow of the third-floor windows. Somewhere up there, Margot was living a life I knew nothing about, with someone who knew parts of her I never had. I thought about our first date, a coffee shop in Seattle, her laugh when I spilled my drink. The way she dabbed at my shirt with napkins, completely unself-conscious. I thought about our wedding day, her father's cold handshake, her mother's tight smile. I thought about last week, when she'd absent-mindedly kissed my forehead while I worked late, her mind already elsewhere. Had it all been a performance? 10 years of careful deception, of measured affection, of a life built on quicksand? My phone buzzed with a text from her. Miss you. Having fun with the girls. Don't wait up. Something cold and methodical awoke inside me. The data analyst in me, the man who found patterns in chaos for a living, saw the puzzle before me with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about years of calculated betrayal. I started the engine but didn't drive toward Seattle and our empty house. Instead, I checked into a motel across town, paid cash, and opened my laptop. If Margot had constructed a double life, there would be evidence. Digital breadcrumbs. Patterns. And patterns were my specialty. As the hours crept toward dawn, I compiled a timeline of her business trips over the past 5 years. Regular as clockwork, every second and fourth Wednesday. Always to Portland. Always overnight. By morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. I wouldn't confront her yet. I wouldn't rage or break down or beg for explanations. No, I would become the shadow she never noticed. I would learn everything about her secret life, about the man who shared her bed in room 318, about the lies that had built the foundation of our marriage. And then, when I had all the pieces, I would decide what kind of justice this betrayal deserved. Morning came with the persistent patter of rain against my motel window. I'd slept for maybe 3 hours, dreamless and heavy. My phone showed 2 missed calls from Margot. I ignored them, watching the screen until it faded to black. I showered, dressed, and drove back to the Rosewood Hotel, parking where I could see the entrance without being easily spotted. The coffee in my travel mug had gone cold, but I drank it anyway, counting the minutes until checkout time. At precisely 11:15 she emerged, Even from a distance, I could read Margot's body language like a familiar book. The slight tilt of her head as she checked her phone. The way she adjusted the strap of her overnight bag. Small, unconscious movements I'd observed for a decade without truly seeing. She wore her charcoal business suit, the one she claimed made her feel powerful in client meetings. I sank lower in my seat as she glanced around before stepping toward the curb. A sleek black Audi pulled up moments later. The window lowered and she leaned down, smiling at someone inside. Not just any smile, the one that crinkled the corners of her eyes, the one I thought belonged to me. She slid into the passenger seat and the car pulled away from the curb. I followed at a careful distance, 3 cars back, just another commuter in the Portland morning traffic. The rain intensified, the wipers on my truck straining against the downpour. They drove to a cafe in the Pearl District, all exposed brick and gleaming windows. I parked across the street and watched through the rain-streaked windshield as Margot and a man entered together. He was tall, well-dressed, with silver threading through dark hair. His hand rested briefly on the small of her back, a casual intimacy that made my stomach knot. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Last summer, our anniversary dinner. Margot excusing herself to take a phone call, returning with flushed cheeks. Work emergency, she'd explained, but her eyes had been too bright, her laugh too quick for the rest of the evening. I'd attributed it to the champagne. How eager I'd been to believe the simplest explanation. I waited 15 minutes before entering the cafe, choosing a corner table partially hidden by a decorative bookshelf. From there, I could see them but remain unnoticed. They sat close, her head occasionally dipping toward his as they shared some private joke. His fingers brushed hers when he passed the sugar. Casual. Practiced. Familiar. I ordered coffee I didn't want and pretended to read news on my phone while straining to catch fragments of their conversation. Can't keep doing this, I heard her say once, her voice carrying during a lull in the cafe's ambient noise. He leaned closer. We've managed for 5 years, Margot. 5 years. Half our marriage. Julian, it's different now, she replied, her voice dropping again. Julian. I committed the name to memory, adding it to my mental file. The man had a name now, an identity. No longer just an abstract threat but a concrete adversary. They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation a dance of intimate murmurs and meaningful glances. When they finally stood to leave, he paid the bill. Outside, under the awning, he kissed her, not passionately, but with the easy confidence of a man on familiar terrain. She glanced around afterward, a habitual caution that hadn't saved her from my discovery. I remained in the cafe, watching through the window as the black Audi pulled away. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the glass, as if it alone understood the rhythm of my thoughts. Another memory, Margot 3 years ago laughing at my suggestion of a weekend trip to Portland. I spend enough time there for work, she'd said. Let's go somewhere new. Her aversion made perfect sense now. Portland wasn't work, it was her other life, one she kept carefully separated from me. I returned to my motel room and opened my laptop. Julian. Likely in his 40s. Wealthy enough to drive an Audi and frequent upscale hotels. Connected to Portland. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A text from Margot lit up my phone. Heading home now. Reunion was great. Can't wait to see you. I stared at the message, at the casual lie delivered with such ease. How many times had I received similar texts? How many times had I accepted them without question? The rain continued to fall as night descended on Portland. I sat in the dark of my motel room, listening to its steady rhythm against the roof. The rain knew her secrets. It had witnessed her comings and goings from the Rosewood Hotel, had dampened her hair as Julian kissed her under cafe awnings, had washed away the footprints of her duplicity for years. Tomorrow I would learn what the rain knew. I would follow the threads of her deception until I held the entire tapestry in my hands. And then I would decide how to unravel it. By morning, I knew more about Julian Pierce than his own mother probably did. The internet is a treasure trove for someone who knows how to look, and I'd spent 15 years finding patterns in data. Julian's digital footprint was substantial. Portland real estate developer, 42 years old, divorced, no children. His company, Pierce Development Group, specialized in luxury condominiums and commercial properties. Their website showcased gleaming towers of glass and steel, monuments to wealth and ambition. I sat cross-legged on the motel bed, surrounded by notes and empty coffee cups, my laptop balanced on my knees. The daylight filtering through thin curtains cast everything in a pale, sickly glow. Julian's social media presence told a story of calculated success. Charity galas. Groundbreaking ceremonies. Ski trips to Aspen. Business awards. A life curated for public consumption, polished to a high shine. No mention of a relationship. No photos with Margot. Nothing to betray their 5-year secret. 5 years ago, Margot had been promoted to marketing director at her firm. 5 years ago, she'd started making regular trips to Portland. 5 years ago, I'd bought her flowers to celebrate her success, never suspecting it had given her the perfect cover for infidelity. I rubbed my eyes, gritty from lack of sleep. A notification popped up on my phone. Margot sending a selfie from our kitchen in Seattle. Home sweet home. House feels empty without you. I stared at her smile, searching for signs of deception I should have seen years ago. Had the slight asymmetry of her grin always been a tell? Had the careful angle of her head been calculated to hide guilt? Or was I now seeing patterns that weren't there, my analyst's mind working overtime to make sense of the senseless? I returned to Julian Pierce. His business records were mostly public. Property purchases, permit applications, tax filings. Pierce Development Group had grown exponentially over the past 5 years, expanding from mid-range apartments to luxury developments. Their flagship project, the Meridian, was a 28-story tower in downtown Portland, completed 2 years ago to critical acclaim. Something about the Meridian tickled my memory. Margot had mentioned it once, casually, during dinner with friends. Portland's skyline is changing, she'd said. There's this gorgeous new building called the Meridian. All glass like a vertical river. She described it with an architect's passion, not a marketer's appreciation. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. I found an article about the Meridian's grand opening. There, in a photo halfway down the page, stood Julian Pierce cutting a ribbon. And in the background, barely visible among the gathered crowd, a familiar profile. Margot. Her hair had been shorter then, but I'd know the curve of her jaw, the slope of her neck anywhere. My hands trembled as I zoomed in on the image. She wasn't just attending, she was watching Julian with naked admiration. How had I missed this? How many other breadcrumbs had she left that I'd been too blind to see? I dug deeper, searching property records for Julian's personal residences. He owned a penthouse in the Meridian itself, plus a waterfront house on the Columbia River. Both purchased within the last 5 years. Both acquired during his relationship with my wife. The question gnawed at me. What was Margot getting from this arrangement? We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. I'd always thought she was content with our modest Seattle home, our quiet life. Had she been yearning for luxury all along? For the kind of opulence Julian Pierce could provide? Or was it something else? Something I couldn't quantify or understand. I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling. The rain had finally stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Tomorrow Margot would expect me home. She would embrace me, ask about my guy's weekend, perhaps suggest takeout and a movie. She would lie to my face with practiced ease, and I would be expected to believe her. But first I needed to pull one more thread. I showered, dressed in my least rumpled clothes, and drove toward the address I'd found for Harold and Evelyn Warren, Margot's parents. They lived in a historic neighborhood in northeast Portland, in a Victorian house that had seen better days. I'd met them only a handful of times in 10 years of marriage. Margot had always claimed they were difficult, disapproving. Another lie, or a rare truth woven into her tapestry of deception. As I parked outside their home, I wondered which version of myself I should present. The oblivious husband? The wronged man seeking answers? The calculating detective assembling evidence? In the end, I decided on a fourth option. The concerned son-in-law worried about Margot's recent behavior. Close enough to the truth to be convincing, distant enough to hide my true purpose. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked exactly like what I was, a man who hadn't slept properly in days, whose world had collapsed around him. But in my eyes I saw something new. A cold determination that would have frightened me 3 days ago. I stepped out of the truck and walked up the cracked pathway to the Warrens' front door, ready to unravel the next thread in Margot's web of lies. The Warren house loomed against the gray sky, its Victorian gables and peeling paint giving it the appearance of an aging dowager clinging to faded glory. Wind chimes tinkled discordantly from the sagging porch as I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through what I imagined were dusty, cluttered rooms. Harold Warren answered on the third knock. He'd aged since I'd last seen him at Christmas 5 years ago, his once robust frame now stooped, his hair completely white. Recognition, then wariness, crossed his face. "Elias," he said, my name emerging like something distasteful. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Harold," I replied, forcing warmth into my voice. "I was in Portland for work and thought I'd stop by. Is Evelyn home as well?" He hesitated before stepping aside, reluctance evident in every movement. The interior was exactly as I'd imagined, cluttered with antiques and heavy furniture, the air stale with the scent of old books and potpourri. "Evelyn," he called toward the back of the house. "We have a visitor." Margot's mother appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She'd aged more gracefully than her husband, her gray hair neatly styled, her posture still proud. Her surprise at seeing me quickly morphed into something more guarded. "Elias, what a surprise. Is Margot with you?" Her eyes darted to the door behind me. "No, she's back in Seattle. I'm here on business." The lie came easily. "Thought I'd check in on you both while I was in town." "How thoughtful," Evelyn said, though her tone suggested anything but. "Come sit down. I'll make tea." I followed Harold into a sitting room dominated by a massive fireplace and bookshelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound volumes no one had opened in years. Photos lined the mantel. Margot as a child, as a teenager, as a college graduate. None from our wedding. None that included me. "So," Harold said as we sat in opposing armchairs, "how's business in Seattle?" "Steady," I replied. "And how are things with you?" "Margot mentioned you've been considering selling this place." Another lie. Margot rarely discussed her parents. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did she?" "We've discussed it, yes. Maintenance on an old house like this. It adds up. But we're waiting for the right opportunity." Evelyn returned with a tray of tea things, the china delicate and clearly reserved for guests deemed worthy. She poured with practiced precision, her movements economical and graceful. I could see Margot in her mannerisms, in the careful way she positioned the cups. "Margot tells us you've been traveling more for work," Evelyn said, handing me a cup. "That must be difficult on your marriage." There was something in her inflection, a subtle emphasis on marriage, that made my skin prickle. "We manage," I said. "Speaking of travel, has Margot visited recently?" She mentioned stopping by during her reunion trip. A glance passed between them, quick but loaded. "No," Harold said too quickly. "We haven't seen her in months." Evelyn's cup clinked against its saucer. "Though she did call last week to check in." "How thoughtful of her," I echoed Evelyn's earlier sentiment, watching their faces carefully. The conversation drifted to neutral topics. Portland weather, local politics, a new restaurant downtown. But underneath ran a current of tension like electricity beneath floorboards. They knew something. Or perhaps they knew everything. I finished my tea and stood to examine the photos on the mantel more closely. "Margot was a beautiful child," I observed. "She has your eyes, Evelyn." "So they say," she replied, her voice tight. A photo at the end caught my attention. Margot, perhaps 22, standing beside a young man at what appeared to be a college graduation. Something about his posture, the set of his shoulders, seemed familiar. "Who's this with Margot?" I asked casually. Harold stood abruptly. "An old friend from college. No one important." The defensiveness in his tone told me otherwise. I committed the image to memory, noting the university logo on the graduation regalia. "I should be going," I said, setting down my cup. "Thank you for the tea." "Give our best to Margot," Evelyn said, escorting me to the door. At the threshold she paused. "Elias, are you and Margot happy?" The question caught me off guard. In her eyes I saw something unexpected, concern, perhaps even pity. "We were," I answered honestly. "At least I thought we were." Her face softened momentarily. "Sometimes people make choices for complicated reasons. Remember that." Before I could respond, she'd closed the door. In my truck, I sat processing the interaction. Their discomfort. The missing wedding photos. The mystery man in the graduation picture. Harold's defensiveness. Evelyn's cryptic parting words. They weren't just cold, distant in-laws. They were complicit in whatever game Margot was playing. But why? What did they gain from their daughter's infidelity? As I drove away from the house on the hill, rain began to fall again, pelting my windshield like accusations. I needed more. Another thread to pull. Another piece of the puzzle. I pointed my truck toward the Rosewood Hotel, determined to uncover what other secrets it held about my wife's shadow life. The Rosewood Hotel lobby was quieter in the afternoon, the morning rush of checkouts replaced by a hushed efficiency. I approached the front desk with practiced confidence, a different clerk on duty than before, a middle-aged woman with a discreet name tag reading Diana. "Good afternoon," I said, sliding my credit card across the polished surface. "I'd like to book a room for tonight. Preferably on the third floor." Diana's fingers moved efficiently across her keyboard. "We have a king available on the third floor, sir. Room 322. Close enough to Margot's regular room to serve my purpose. I nodded, maintaining the calm demeanor of a business traveler despite the thundering in my chest. Perfect. I've stayed here before, but it's been a while. Has the hotel changed ownership recently? A casual question designed to open conversation. No, sir. Same ownership for 15 years now. She smiled professionally while processing my card. That's what I thought. The service has always been excellent. I particularly appreciate your discretion with frequent guests. Her smile remained fixed, but a wariness entered her eyes. We value all our guests' privacy, sir. Of course. I accepted the key card she handed me. I don't suppose you'd be able to pull up my past stays? For my expense reports. I seem to have misplaced the receipts. Certainly if you've stayed with us before. Your name? Julian Pierce. Her fingers paused momentarily over the keyboard. A slight narrowing of her eyes, recognition of the name. I'll need to see ID for that, sir. Actually, I said, letting my facade drop slightly, I'm not Julian Pierce. But I believe he's a regular guest. As is my wife, Margot Carver. Diana's professional mask slipped, just for a moment. Sir, I can't discuss other guests. I understand completely, I interrupted softly, sliding $200 bills across the counter. I'm not asking you to breach confidentiality. Just misplace a receipt. One that might have both their names on it. Her eyes flicked from the money to my face. I saw calculation there, then resignation. She reached beneath the counter, extracted a manila folder, and walked into a back office. 3 minutes later, she returned and discreetly slid a folded paper toward me along with my room key. The lobby printer sometimes produces duplicate receipts. We normally shred them. Her voice was neutral, her eyes meeting mine briefly before shifting away. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Carver. In my room, clinically clean and anonymously luxurious, I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. A hotel receipt from 2 months ago. 2 nights, room 318. Champagne service, room service for 2, late checkout. Julian Pierce's name and credit card, with Margot listed as the second guest. But it wasn't the confirmation of their affair that made my blood run cold. It was the notation at the bottom, guest loyalty program, gold level member, 84 stays this year. 84 stays. Not twice a month as Cameron had suggested. More than once a week. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, trying to reconcile this new information with what I knew of Margot's schedule. She traveled for work, yes. But not this frequently. Not this consistently. Unless she wasn't always out of town when she claimed to be. How many Seattle client dinners had actually been nights in Portland? How many early meetings had been mornings spent in this very hotel? The magnitude of deception required staggered me. I laid back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, memories washing over me like waves on a shore. Last November, Margot missing my company holiday party. Food poisoning, she'd claimed, looking pale and drawn the next morning. Had she been here instead? The jewelry I didn't recognize appearing in her collection. Sample gifts from clients, she'd explained. Gifts from Julian? The sudden passion for hiking last summer, solo trips to clear her head. Had she even gone near a trail? My analyst's mind, trained to find connections, now revealed a pattern of absences and excuses stretching back years. How had I been so blind? How had I accepted each explanation without question? Because I'd trusted her. Because I'd believed in us. I pulled out my phone, opening the photo album labeled, Us. 10 years of smiling selfies, vacation snapshots, quiet moments at home. A digital record of what I'd thought was happiness. Looking at her face in these images, had she been thinking of him even then? Had each smile hidden thoughts of their next rendezvous? A text from Margot lit up my screen. Hope your drive back is going well. Making your favorite dinner tonight. Another lie. I was supposed to be driving back from Davis's cabin, not sitting in the very hotel where she conducted her affair. I switched to my calendar app, methodically marking every day Margot had been away or working late over the past year. Then I cross-referenced these dates with my newfound knowledge of her hotel stays. The pattern that emerged was both obvious and devastating. She wasn't just having an affair. She was living a double life with military precision. Seattle wife on weekends and some weekdays. Portland mistress in between. But why Portland? Why not somewhere closer to Seattle? And why the same hotel, the same room, choices that increased her risk of discovery? Unless the affair wasn't the only secret she was keeping. I stared at the hotel receipt, at the evidence of a life I hadn't known existed. Tomorrow I would return to Seattle, would sit across from Margot at our dining table, would watch her serve my favorite dinner, with loving attention. And I would begin to unravel the final threads of her deception. The drive back to Seattle should have taken 3 hours. I made it in 4, pulling over twice when the reality of my situation hit me like physical blows. Each time, I sat with my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing through the pain until it subsided into something manageable. Something cold and hard that I could use. Our house looked exactly as I'd left it. The blue Craftsman bungalow we'd painted together 2 summers ago, the garden Margot had meticulously planned but rarely tended. A portrait of domestic contentment that now seemed as artificial as a movie set. I sat in the driveway watching through the kitchen window as Margot moved about, preparing the dinner she'd promised. Her hair was pulled back in the messy ponytail she wore at home, her face free of makeup. This was the Margot I knew, or thought I knew. The comfortable, casual wife, not the polished woman who'd emerged from the Rosewood Hotel. She looked up, spotted my truck and waved with a bright smile. I forced myself to wave back, to step out of the vehicle, to walk the path to our front door like a man returning home rather than a detective infiltrating enemy territory. "You're back." She greeted me with a kiss that landed on the corner of my mouth, her arms circling my neck. I breathed in her familiar scent, rosemary shampoo, the faint sweetness of the lotion she applied every morning, and wondered if Julian Pierce preferred this Margot or the other one, the one who spent nights in room 318. "Traffic was brutal," I said, the lie coming easily now. "Poor baby. Well, dinner's almost ready. How was the cabin? Did you and Davis have fun?" I'd never gone to Davis's cabin. I'd never called Davis at all. But I manufactured stories of fishing and beer by a fireplace, of the solitude of the mountains, while she nodded and served the lasagna she knew I loved. "And how was the reunion?" I asked, forcing genuine curiosity into my voice. "Oh, you know." She waved dismissively. "Everyone trying to impress each other with their careers and perfect lives. Jessica Bryant, remember I told you about her? Has 4 kids now and looks exhausted. And Mark Simmons is completely bald." She launched into detailed accounts of people I'd never heard of, constructing an elaborate fiction of a high school reunion that had never happened. I watched her animated expressions, her practiced gestures, with a detachment that frightened me. Who was this woman? Had I ever known her at all? After dinner, while Margot showered, I sat in our home office with my laptop. Julian Pierce had been easy to find online. Now I dug deeper, looking for connections beyond the professional facade. I found it on X, buried in a post from 3 years ago. A candid photo taken at a charity fundraiser by another attendee. Julian in a tuxedo, champagne flute in hand, leaning close to whisper something to a silver-haired couple. The Warrens, Margot's parents. Their faces showed none of the coldness they directed at me. They were smiling, comfortable, familiar with Julian in a way that spoke of long acquaintance. The caption read, "Portland's finest at the Children's Hospital Gala. Julian Pierce charming potential investors as always." So they knew each other. Well enough to attend events together. Well enough for Julian to charm them. Another piece slotting into place. I searched further, finding Julian's name on the donor list for several political campaigns. His company had expanded aggressively over the past 5 years, acquiring prime real estate throughout Portland and developing luxury properties that sold for millions. A financial news article from last year caught my attention. Pierce Development Group secures exclusive contract for waterfront redevelopment. Controversial decision raises questions about city council connections. The article detailed allegations of preferential treatment, of permits fast-tracked while other developers waited months, of zoning exemptions granted with minimal oversight. Nothing illegal, but the implication of influence was clear. Did Margot's marketing firm handle PR for Pierce Development? Was that their connection? I'd never asked detailed questions about her clients, respecting the confidentiality she claimed was necessary. Another blind spot. Another failure of attention. The shower stopped running. I closed the browser tabs but saved the X post to my phone. Tomorrow I decided I would meet Julian Pierce face to face. Not as Margot's husband but as someone else. Someone with information he might want or might fear. Margot emerged from the bathroom in her usual sleepwear, flannel pants and an old university t-shirt, her wet hair wrapped in a towel. Domesticity as performance art. "Coming to bed?" she asked, her smile soft, intimate. "Soon," I replied. "Need to check a few work emails first." She kissed the top of my head as she passed, her fingers trailing across my shoulders. "Don't be too long. I've missed you." I waited until she'd left the room before opening a new browser window. I booked a return flight to Portland for the following morning and reserved a rental car under a different credit card. Then I drafted an email to my boss, requesting 3 days of emergency personal leave. As I crawled into bed beside my sleeping wife, I felt the distance between us, not just the physical space, but the yawning chasm of deception that separated the life I'd believed in from the reality I was now discovering. I didn't touch her. Couldn't bear to bridge that distance with false intimacy. Instead, I lay in the dark, planning my confrontation with the puppet master who'd become entangled with my wife, my in-laws, and the wreckage of what I'd thought was my life. I left our house at dawn, leaving a note about an emergency client meeting in Tacoma. Another lie to add to the growing collection between us. Margot had mumbled sleepily, kissed me without opening her eyes, and rolled back into dreams I couldn't begin to imagine. The morning flight to Portland was half empty, populated by business travelers staring into laptops and coffee cups. I sat by the window watching Seattle disappear beneath clouds, feeling a strange detachment from the city I'd called home for 12 years. Before confronting Julian Pierce, I needed more information, something that would give me leverage or at least understanding. The Warrens were my best lead. Evelyn's cryptic parting words suggested she might be willing to talk, given the right approach. I drove the rental car back to their aging Victorian, parking a block away and walking through the morning mist. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets damp from overnight rain. A newspaper lay untouched on their porch, still wrapped in plastic. I knocked, prepared to wait, but Evelyn opened the door almost immediately as if she'd been expecting someone. Her face registered surprise, then resignation. "I thought you might come back," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Harold's at his physical therapy appointment. We have 45 minutes. The house felt different without Harold's oppressive presence. Less suffocating, though still heavy with the weight of old furniture and older secrets. "Coffee?" Evelyn asked, leading me to the kitchen rather than the formal sitting room. This was the heart of the house, with worn countertops and cabinets painted a cheery yellow that had faded to the color of old parchment. "Please," I said, taking a seat at a small breakfast table by the window. "You knew I'd come back." She busied herself with the coffee maker, her back to me. "You have questions. That's natural. Did you know about them? About Margot and Julian?" Her shoulders stiffened slightly. "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air between us. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill, peered in, then flew away. "How long?" "Longer than you think." She placed a mug before me, chipped around the rim, the university logo faded from years of washing. They met in college. Finance and marketing classes together. The graduation photo I'd seen on the mantel. The old friend Harold had dismissed so quickly. They dated? Briefly. She sat across from me, her own mug cradled between slender hands. It ended badly. Or so we thought. What happened? Evelyn's eyes met mine, assessing. Julian came from money. Old Portland money. Margot didn't. His parents made that very clear to her. So they broke up? Julian broke up with her. Then he got engaged to someone suitable. Her mouth twisted on the last word. Margot was devastated. Transferred to another university. Changed her major. Met you a few years later. I tried to reconcile this history with the woman I'd married. But they reconnected. 5 years ago. Julian's development company needed marketing help. Margot's firm was recommended. Evelyn took a sip of coffee. By then he was divorced. Margot was vulnerable. Vulnerable? I echoed. She was married to me. Something like pity crossed Evelyn's face. Marriage isn't always protection against past wounds, Elias. I felt anger rising, sharp and hot. And you encouraged this? Your daughter's affair? We didn't encourage anything. Defensiveness crept into her tone. But we understood it. Their history doesn't justify betrayal, I cut in. There's more to this than an old flame rekindled, isn't there? You and Harold know Julian too well. That charity gala photo. Evelyn's coffee mug clattered against the table. What photo? I pulled out my phone, showed her the ex-post. You all look very friendly for people who supposedly disapprove of Julian Pierce. Color drained from her face. You don't understand. Then help me understand. What's really happening here? She stood abruptly, moving to a drawer beside the refrigerator. Her hands trembled as she withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. Harold will be furious, she murmured, more to herself than to me. But perhaps it's time. She placed the envelope before me. Open it. Inside was a faded photograph. Margot, perhaps 16, standing between Evelyn and a man who wasn't Harold. The resemblance between Margot and this stranger was unmistakable, Same eyes, same smile, same dimple in the left cheek. Who is this? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Margot's biological father. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas Pierce. Julian's uncle. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Margot and Julian are cousins? First cousins once removed, technically. Evelyn reclaimed the photo, handling it with care. Thomas was not a good man. But I loved him. When I got pregnant, he wanted nothing to do with us. His brother, Julian's father, paid me to disappear, to never contact the family again. Harold knew. I met Harold when Margot was 2. He knew everything, agreed to raise her as his own. Her eyes grew distant. The Pierce family has owed Margot her entire life. When Julian discovered who she really was. When was that? 5 years ago. Some medical records from Thomas were needed. Julian saw Margot's name. Started asking questions. The timeline matched perfectly. The beginning of their affair coincided with this discovery. So their relationship isn't romantic. Is what? Revenge? Compensation? Evelyn's laugh was bitter. It started as a business arrangement. The Pierces owed Margot her birthright. Julian found a way to provide it. And now? I pressed. She looked away. Things change. Feelings complicate business. I stood, needing distance, air, perspective. Does Margot know you've told me this? No. Evelyn's voice hardened. And she won't hear it from me. What you do with this information is your choice. As I drove away from the Warren house, the photograph of Margot and her real father burned in my memory. Not just an affair then. A family secret spanning generations. A debt being collected in the currency of luxury hotels and real estate developments. And somewhere in this tangled history, my marriage had become collateral damage. The headquarters of Pierce Development Group occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in downtown Portland. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city and the distant mountains beyond, a visual reminder of the power and perspective that came with wealth. I stood in the marble-floored lobby, dressed in a suit I'd purchased that morning, my Seattle casual wardrobe inadequate for the confrontation ahead. I have an appointment with Mr. Pierce, I told the receptionist, projecting confidence I didn't feel. William Taylor, from Seattle Investment Partners. No appointment existed. No Seattle Investment Partners existed. But I'd learned from my years analyzing data that speaking with authority was often enough to open doors. One moment, Mr. Taylor. She made a call, spoke quietly, then directed me to the elevator. 32nd floor. Mr. Pierce's assistant will meet you. The elevator rose silently, each floor increasing my determination. I'd rehearsed various approaches during the drive downtown, unsure which would be most effective with a man like Julian Pierce. Business rival? Potential investor? Concerned citizen with questions about zoning variances? In the end, I decided on something closer to the truth. Information was my leverage, information about his connection to Margot, about their shared family history, about whatever scheme they'd concocted together. The assistant, young, polished, professionally warm, greeted me and led me through an open workspace of glass partitions and sleek furniture. Staff members glanced up briefly as we passed, then returned to their screens and calls. At the far end, a set of double doors opened into a corner office larger than my entire first apartment. Julian Pierce stood behind an enormous desk of polished concrete and steel, his back to the view of Portland spread below. In person, he was taller than I'd expected, his salt and pepper hair expertly styled, his tailored suit suggesting wealth without flaunting it. His eyes, calculating, assessing, fixed on me with immediate suspicion. Mr. Taylor. He didn't extend his hand. Alyssa says you're from Seattle Investment Partners, but I don't recall scheduling this meeting. I waited until his assistant had closed the door behind her. That's because I'm not William Taylor, and there is no Seattle Investment Partners. His posture shifted subtly, weight redistributed, shoulders squaring. Preparation for confrontation. Then who are you and why are you in my office? My name is Elias Carver. I watched for recognition, saw it flicker across his face before he controlled his expression. Margot's husband. Silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken calculations. Then, surprisingly, Julian smiled. Well, Elias Carver. This is unexpected. He gestured to a seating area by the windows. Please sit. Would you like a drink? It's 5 o'clock somewhere, as they say. It's 10 in the morning, I replied, remaining standing. And yet, this conversation might benefit from alcohol. He moved to a cabinet, withdrew a crystal decanter. Bourbon? I'm not here for social niceties. He poured himself 2 fingers of amber liquid anyway. No, I imagine you're not. How much do you know? The directness caught me off guard. I'd expected denials, evasions. About your affair with my wife? Or about your family connection? He raised an eyebrow, sipped his bourbon. Interesting. Evelyn talked then. She filled in some gaps. But not everything. He settled into a leather chair, motioning again for me to sit. This time I did, choosing a seat that kept the desk between us. So, Elias, what is it you want from this meeting? To punch me? To threaten me? To demand I never see Margot again? His casual arrogance ignited something cold inside me. I reached into my jacket, withdrew my phone, and placed it on the desk between us. Actually, I came to listen, I said, activating the voice recorder app with a subtle tap. To understand exactly what you and Margot have been doing for the past 5 years. Julian's eyes narrowed at the phone. Recording without consent is illegal in Oregon. So is fraud, I imagine. I leaned forward. The waterfront development. The expedited permits. The zoning exceptions. Margot's marketing firm handling the PR while you two meet at the Rosewood Hotel 84 times a year. Interesting coincidence. Something shifted in his expression, the confidence slipping just enough to reveal calculation beneath. You've been busy. I analyze data for a living. Finding patterns is what I do. He swirled the bourbon in his glass, considering. And what pattern do you think you've found? I think the Pierce family has been using Margot to influence decisions, to smooth regulatory paths, to create a narrative that benefits your developments. I think you're using your connection as cousins to enrich yourselves. Julian's laugh was unexpected, genuine. Cousins? Is that what Evelyn told you? My certainty wavered. She showed me a photograph. Thomas Pierce was not Margot's father. Julian set down his glass with deliberate care. That's the story Evelyn tells herself. The truth is messier, less convenient. Thomas wasn't interested in women, Elias. He was my gay uncle who died of AIDS in '97. The revelation hit like a slap. Then, Margot's father was my father, Richard Pierce. Julian's smile held no warmth. We're half-siblings, Elias. Not cousins. Siblings. I felt the ground shift beneath me once again. Does Margot know? Of course she knows. It's why she sought me out 5 years ago, after her mother finally told her the truth. He leaned forward. The question you should be asking is, what are you going to do about it now that you know? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Margot's name flashed on the screen, interrupting the recording. Julian Pierce smiled, the expression of a predator who's spotted weakness. Perhaps you should answer that. I have a feeling your wife might be wondering where you really are today. I let Margot's call go to voicemail, maintaining eye contact with Julian. His smug confidence only strengthened my resolve. Half-siblings, I said, processing this new revelation. Sharing business interests in hotel rooms. How very modern of you. Something dangerous flashed in Julian's eyes. Careful with implications, Elias. Our relationship isn't what you think. Then explain it to me. I tapped my still recording phone. Make me understand. Julian stood, moving to the window. Against the backdrop of Portland's skyline, he cut an imposing figure, the embodiment of the power his family had wielded for generations. When Margot learned the truth 5 years ago, she was angry. Rightfully so. His voice was controlled, measured. 32 years of lies from Evelyn. A birthright denied. A father, our father, who acknowledged me but rejected her existence. So this is about revenge? Money? He turned, studying me with newfound interest. It's about justice. Richard Pierce was worth millions when he died 7 years ago. His will left everything to me, his only child. Margot deserved her share. And the hotel meetings? The affair? Julian laughed. There is no affair, Elias. There never was. We meet to discuss business, the systematic reclamation of what should have been partially hers. I wanted to believe him. The alternative was too grotesque to contemplate. But doubts lingered. 84 hotel stays? You couldn't meet in your office. The Rosewood is neutral ground. Away from my board's prying eyes and questions about who this woman is and why I'm restructuring company ownership. He returned to his seat, leaning forward. And yes, sometimes those meetings run late. Sometimes it's easier to stay the night rather than drive back to Seattle. In the same room? The Rosewood keeps a record of every guest. 2 names on the registration is cleaner for what we're doing. He shrugged. The hotel assumes what people always assume. It's beneficial cover. My phone buzzed again, a text from Margot. Where are you? Your office says you're not in Tacoma. Julian noticed my expression. She's figuring it out. Detective skills must run in your household. I ignored the jab. If what you're saying is true, why the secrecy? Why wouldn't Margot tell me she'd discovered a half-brother, that she was claiming her inheritance? Ask yourself what you would have done, Elias. Julian's voice hardened. Would you have supported her pursuit of Pierce Development shares? Or would you have counseled forgiveness, moving forward, letting the past remain buried? The question struck home. I prided myself on being reasonable, practical. Would I have encouraged Margot to wade into a complex legal battle against a powerful family? Or would I have urged her to protect our stable, comfortable life? So instead she lied. For 5 years. She protected you from complications while handling them herself. Julian leaned back. Margot is remarkably self-sufficient. It's something I admire about my sister. The word sister still jolted me. I tried to reconcile the Margot I knew with this woman who had methodically pursued justice against her biological father's family for years, all while maintaining our marriage as a separate, protected space. The development projects, I said, returning to my original suspicions. The expedited permits, the zoning variances. All legitimate. Julian's interruption was sharp. Margot's marketing expertise helped, certainly. But we've broken no laws. We've simply optimized existing systems. My phone buzzed a third time. Margot again. I just called Davis. He says he hasn't seen you in months. What's going on? The reckoning was approaching faster than I'd anticipated. Julian saw it too, his expression softening into something almost like sympathy. She deserves to hear the truth from you, he said quietly. That you've been tracking her, investigating her. Following her to Portland. Like she deserves to hear from you that you've been using her? I countered. 5 years of reclaiming her birthright, and what does she have to show for it? You're still living in luxury while she owns 30% of Pierce Development Group. Julian cut me off. Worth approximately $86 million at current valuation. The figure stunned me into silence. 86 million. My wife, my Margot who clipped coupons and worried about our mortgage, was worth $86 million. And had told me nothing. My phone rang again. Margot's face filled the screen. This time I answered. Where are you? Her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. I think you know, I replied, watching Julian's face. I'm in Portland. With your brother. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear her breathing, could almost see her mind working through implications, calculating responses. Don't move, she finally said. Either of you. I'm on my way. She hung up before I could respond. Julian and I sat in silence, 2 men waiting for the woman who connected us to arrive and reveal which version of herself she would present. For what it's worth, Julian said eventually, she does love you. That part was never a lie. I looked at him, this stranger who knew secrets about my wife that I was only beginning to discover, and felt nothing but hollow uncertainty. I'm not sure I know what parts of my marriage were real anymore, I replied. But I guess I'm about to find out. 3 hours passed before Margot arrived. 3 hours in which Julian and I circled each other with cautious conversation, neither willing to reveal too much, both aware that the woman connecting us was speeding toward Portland to confront truths long hidden. Julian ordered lunch, expensive sandwiches from a nearby deli, which I refused to touch. He worked periodically, taking calls, sending emails, performing the routine tasks of a CEO as if my presence was merely an unusual scheduling quirk rather than an existential threat. I used the time to observe his office, noting the strategic placement of awards and photographs. A picture of Julian with the mayor at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Another with the governor at a charity function. The physical manifestation of influence, carefully curated. She's here, Julian said, glancing at his phone. Coming up now. I stood, unsure where to position myself in this unfamiliar territory. By the window? Seated? Standing by the door? Where does one wait to confront a spouse about 5 years of monumental deception? When Margot entered, she looked nothing like the comfortable, casual wife who had kissed me goodbye that morning. This was the other Margot, the one I'd glimpsed emerging from the Rosewood Hotel. Polished, professional, her charcoal suit and heels speaking of boardrooms rather than our kitchen table. Her eyes moved from Julian to me, her expression unreadable. Well, she said, closing the door behind her. This is unexpected. The understatement hung in the air between us. Margot, Julian began. Not now, Julian. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. She focused on me. How did you find out? I tracked your phone to the Rosewood when you were supposedly at your reunion, I said. The rest followed from there. A flicker of something, admiration? Dismay? Crossed her face. And you've been, what? Following me? Investigating me? Yes. For how long? 4 days. She nodded slowly, calculating. And in 4 days you uncovered what I've spent 5 years protecting. Her gaze shifted to Julian. What did you tell him? The truth, he replied. About Richard. About your shares in the company. Margot moved to the window looking out over Portland. In profile, I could see her resemblance to Julian more clearly now, the same determined set of the jaw, the same vertical line that appeared between their eyebrows when concentrating. I wanted to tell you, she said finally, turning back to me. So many times. But there was never a right moment to say, by the way, I've discovered my father wasn't my father, my mother lied my entire life, and I'm secretly reclaiming my multimillion-dollar inheritance from my half-brother's company. You could have tried, I said, hearing the hurt beneath my anger. At any point in 5 years. You could have tried. And risk everything? Our life? Your contentment. She shook her head. You like things orderly, Elias. Predictable. This, she gestured around Julian's office, is neither of those things. So instead you lied. Created an elaborate double life. I compartmentalized, she corrected. Our marriage was separate from this. 84 hotel stays last year, I countered. That's not compartmentalizing. That's living 2 entirely different lives. Julian cleared his throat. Perhaps I should give you both some privacy. Stay, Margot and I said simultaneously. You're as much a part of this as we are, I added. I want to understand exactly what's been happening for 5 years. The money. The business dealings. All of it. Margot exchanged a glance with Julian, some silent communication passing between siblings who, despite their late discovery of each other, had developed their own language. Show him, she said. Julian hesitated, then moved to his computer. With a few keystrokes, he brought up a financial summary on the large monitor mounted on his wall. Pierce Development Group, he explained, was built on land that rightfully belonged to both Pierce children. When I learned about Margot, I began the process of making things right. Without informing your board, I noted. They answered to me, not the other way around. His dismissive tone spoke volumes about how power operated in his world. Over the past 5 years, we've structured a series of subsidiary companies and transferred assets. You can skip the corporate shell game, I interrupted. What's the bottom line? Margot stepped forward. The bottom line is that I now control 30% of all Pierce holdings. Property worth nearly $90 million. And I've leveraged that position to ensure the company operates more ethically than it did under Richard Pierce. The waterfront development? I asked. Will include affordable housing units and public green space, she answered. Requirements I insisted on. And your parents? The Warrens? A shadow crossed her face. They receive a monthly stipend for their silence and cooperation. Harold's medical care alone costs thousands. The arrangement benefits everyone. Except me, I said quietly. I've been living with a stranger. Margot reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Elias, were you ever going to tell me? After the transfers were complete? After you had secured your millions? Or was I just going to be the oblivious husband who never needed to know? Her silence was answer enough. I need air, I said, moving toward the door. I need to think. Don't leave like this, Margot said, her composure cracking. Please. We need to talk. We've had 5 years to talk, I replied, hand on the doorknob. You chose not to. Now I'm choosing to step away. As I walked out of Julian Pierce's office, I heard him say softly to Margot, let him go. He needs time. What I needed, I thought as I rode the elevator down, was the truth. And I still wasn't convinced I had it. I drove aimlessly through Portland's rain-slicked streets, my mind churning with revelations. The Margot I thought I knew had vanished, replaced by a woman of secret millions and hidden agendas. My analyst's brain struggled to reconcile the loving wife who remembered my birthday with the calculating businesswoman who had concealed a fortune. Eventually, I found myself at the Rosewood Hotel, drawn back to where this journey had begun. The lobby welcomed me with its understated luxury, the same polished surfaces and soft lighting that had framed my first discovery of betrayal. Cameron was at the front desk again, recognition dawning in his eyes as I approached. Room 318, I said quietly. I'd like to see it. He hesitated. Sir, I'm not sure. I placed $500 on the counter. Please. I need to understand. Something in my expression must have conveyed my desperation. He glanced around, then discreetly passed me a key card. Housekeeping has finished. You have 30 minutes before I need to report the key missing. The elevator carried me to the 3rd floor, each floor number illuminating with the weight of memory. Room 318 was at the end of a hushed corridor, its anonymous door identical to dozens of others. Inside, I found not the tawdry love nest I had initially imagined, but a spacious suite with separate sleeping and living areas. A conference table occupied one corner, littered with documents and folders, the residue of business, not passion. I moved through the space like an archaeologist examining artifacts, absorbing details. A laptop power cord. Legal pads filled with notes in Margot's precise handwriting. Property assessments. Zoning documents. A framed photograph of Julian and Margot, both in business attire, standing before the Meridian building on its opening day. There was no evidence of romance, no lingering perfume or intimate clothing. Instead, I found the workings of a methodical campaign to claim an inheritance and transform a business. This room had been their headquarters, not their trysting place. My phone buzzed with messages from Margot, increasingly urgent. I ignored them, continuing my exploration. In the desk drawer, I found a leather portfolio embossed with Margot's initials. Inside were documents detailing the complete financial arrangement between the Pierce siblings, not just the 30% ownership Julian had mentioned, but evidence of much more complex maneuvering. Pierce Development Group was barely the surface. The siblings had established multiple enterprises across Oregon and Washington, with tentacles extending into local politics, charitable foundations, and media companies. Their influence reached further than I'd imagined, reshaping Portland's development landscape according to their vision. And buried within the documents, a pending application for a Seattle-based subsidiary, Pierce Northwest, with Margot listed as CEO. A new headquarters to be built 3 blocks from our home. She hadn't been planning to reveal her secret life. She had been preparing to merge it with our existing one, on her terms, in her time. I was still absorbing this when the hotel room door opened. I expected Margot, but Julian Pierce entered alone, his expression grave. "She's looking for you," he said, closing the door behind him. "Called me when you wouldn't answer your phone. How did you know I'd be here?" "It's where I would go. To see the evidence for myself." He glanced around the suite. "Finding what you expected?" "Finding more than I expected." I held up the portfolio. "Pierce Northwest? A Seattle headquarters?" She was never going to tell me until it was a fait accompli. Julian sighed, sinking into an armchair. "Margot has trust issues. For obvious reasons. I'm her husband. And Evelyn was her mother. Harold her father. Until they weren't." His voice held unexpected bitterness. "Our family legacy is one of lies disguised as protection. I studied him, this half-brother whose existence had upended my world. Why are you here, Julian? Shouldn't you be with your sister, strategizing damage control?" "Because I owe you the full truth," he replied. "Something Margot may not give you." "Which is?" "She's planning to leave you." His words landed like physical blows. "Not immediately. But eventually. Once everything is secured." "How do you know that?" "Because she told me." Julian met my gaze directly. 3 months ago. When Pierce Northwest was approved. She said, and I quote, "Once I'm established in Seattle, I can finally stop living this exhausting double life." I felt the room tilt beneath me. She was using me. All this time. No. Julian's denial was unexpectedly forceful. "She loves you. But she loves her newfound power more. The control she never had growing up. The ability to shape her own destiny." He leaned forward. "I recognize it because I see it in myself. It's the Pierce blood. Why tell me this? You're betraying your sister's confidence. Because I've watched this play out before. Our father did the same to our mothers, used them until they no longer served his purpose." Julian's face hardened. "I don't want Margot to become him. And right now she's on that path." My phone buzzed again. Margot texting, "I'm coming to the Rosewood. We need to talk." Julian saw the message and stood. "You have a choice to make. Confront her with what you know, or let her continue controlling the narrative." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think she can be better than our father. Than me. But only if someone holds her accountable." As the door closed behind him, I sat alone in room 318, surrounded by evidence of my wife's secret life, waiting for her arrival and the reckoning that would determine our future. 20 minutes passed before I heard Margot's keycard in the lock. When she entered room 318, she was alone, her composure visibly frayed around the edges. Her eyes took in the open portfolio on the table, the scattered documents I'd been examining, and finally settled on me. "You've been busy," she said, closing the door softly behind her. "So have you. For 5 years." I gestured to the Pierce Northwest papers. "Planning your grand entrance into Seattle business. 3 blocks from our home." She moved further into the room, maintaining distance between us. "I was going to tell you. When the time was right. Like you were going to tell me about being Richard Pierce's daughter? About your 30% stake in a development empire? About your plans to leave me once everything was secured?" Her eyes widened at the last accusation. "Julian," she breathed, understanding immediately. "He told you that. Is it true?" Margot sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "It's complicated. Uncomplicated for me." She met my gaze directly. 3 months ago, yes. I considered it. The double life was exhausting. Pretending to be just Margot Carver, marketing director with a modest salary, when I was becoming someone with real influence. Real power. She swallowed hard. But that was before. Before what? Before I realized what I was becoming. Her voice dropped. Like my father. Treating people as pieces on a chessboard. Even you. Especially you. I studied her face, searching for the truth beneath her words. And now? Now I don't know. She gestured helplessly. Everything's happening too fast. This confrontation. Your investigation. Julian's betrayal. Her eyes hardened momentarily on that last point. My carefully constructed plans falling apart. Your carefully constructed lies, you mean? Yes, she admitted, surprising me with her directness. My lies. My compartmentalization. My attempt to be 2 different people at once. She leaned forward. But my love for you was never a lie, Elias. That part was real. How can I possibly believe that now? I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. How can I trust anything you say? Margot stood, moving to the window. Rain streaked the glass, Portland's eternal tears blurring the city beyond. You can't. I haven't earned your trust. She turned back to face me. But I can give you something else. The truth. All of it. And then a choice. For the next half hour, Margot spoke without interruption, laying bare the complete history of her discovery, her alliance with Julian, and their systematic plan to reclaim her birthright while transforming Pierce Development Group into something more ethical than their father had built. She detailed the shell companies, the political connections, the careful manipulation of public opinion through her marketing expertise. And then she told me about the moment, 3 months ago, when she'd looked in the mirror and seen Richard Pierce staring back at her. The coldness in her own eyes. The calculation in her smile. The way she'd begun measuring relationships by their utility rather than their meaning. I scared myself, she admitted. And that's when I knew I needed to change course. Not abandon what I'd built, but approach it differently. With honesty. Starting with you. Yet you said nothing for 3 more months. Because I'm a coward, she said simply. Because I was afraid of exactly this, losing you when you learned the truth. I stood, needing to move, to think. And Julian? Why would he betray your confidence now? Because he needs me to need him, she said, insight sharpening her tone. If I reconcile with you, build an honest life that includes both my husband and my business, he loses his influence over me. He becomes just a business partner, not my sole confidant. The pieces clicked into place. Julian's unexpected visit, his selective revelations, his concern disguised as principle. Another manipulation in a family built on manipulations. So what happens now? I asked. Margot took a deep breath. That depends on you. I can't undo the past 5 years. I can only move forward with honesty. She stepped closer. I want to try again, Elias. No more secrets. No more double life. Everything in the open. My business, my wealth, my plans for Pierce Northwest. With you as my partner in all of it if you want that. And if I don't? Then I'll give you whatever you need for a clean break. Her voice wavered slightly. A generous settlement. A quick divorce. Your freedom. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers demanding resolution. The same sound that had accompanied me in my truck 5 days ago, when I'd first watched Margot's signal glowing on my phone screen. 5 days that had revealed a lifetime of lies. I looked at my wife, this complicated, driven, flawed woman who had kept so much hidden, yet now stood before me offering transparent truth. I need time, I said finally. To think. To decide. She nodded, acceptance in her eyes. I understand. As I walked out of room 318, leaving Margot and the evidence of her shadow life behind, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, not the burden of knowledge but the heavier load of suspicion and fear. Whatever I decided, it would be with clear eyes and complete information. The choice would be mine. And for the first time in 5 days, perhaps in 5 years, that felt like enough.